Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge, a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jocko Selberg, and somewhere out there in Gotham City is the multi-talented Barbara Frontera, and together we co-host the lounge. Before we kick it off, just a few ground rules. We'll be recording today's session, so if you do not wish to be recorded, please make sure your camera and microphones are turned off. We also ask that you please keep the side chat activity to a minimum during the presentation. And after Alicia's talk, we'll have a quick question and answer period, and hopefully a nice conversation will ensue. And the recordings will be posted up on our Vimeo page, on our Vimeo Complexity Lounge page in the next couple of days, and that is where you'll find all of our past videos from the lounge. Our guest today is Alicia Juarrero. Alicia is the founder and president of Vector Analytica, with a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Miami, where she is currently a research associate. She's the author of the book, Dynamics in Action from 1998, as well as the upcoming book, which we want to plug today as much as possible. The Context Changes Everything is the name of the book, coming out in June of 2023, both on MIT Press. In this talk today, Alicia will defend the importance of distinguishing between constraints, both enabling and governing, on the one hand, and causes on the other. And we'll follow that up with some Q&A afterwards. So Alicia, welcome to the Complexity Lounge.
Thank you so much, Jocko. I want to really thank Barbara and Jocko for inviting me. It almost feels like coming home. I know so many of you guys. And when Jocko suggested the title Causes and Constraints as opposed to Causes and Effects, I really like that. And it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I want to talk about the differences between causes and constraints because there are all sorts of views about what constraints really are. Why don't we just get rid of that term? It's too confusing and so on. And I think that happens because the term constraint is traditionally commonly used to mean a restriction, a limitation. And so when I start talking about enabling constraints, that throws everything off kilter. The term enabling constraint goes as far back, I believe, as the 70s. And Howard Pattee, who is a Stanford PhD biologist, now in his mid-90s. So you can blame Howard Pattee and then folks like Stan Salty who used it. Mostly biologists tend to use it, and it has helped me a lot. I got interested in this whole topic because of the question of how intentions cause actions. Some of you might know that the first sentence of that 1999 MIT Press book was, what is the difference between a wink and a blink? According to philosophers, blinks are not really actions. Blinks are, quote, mere behavior. That is, they are simply a reflex reaction of, say, some dust being thrown in my face. Philosophers consider only behavior that is caused by intentions to be action proper. And the reason why it's an interesting issue is because you really cannot be held morally responsible and legally liable for mere behavior, for reflex. There are all sorts of caveats to that comment, but bear with me. Whereas, for example, the difference between first, second, third degree homicide turns precisely on whether it was intentional, whether it was premeditated, and so on. So the question that has vexed philosophers for millennia has been, what's an intention and how does it cause or bring about action? And you'll notice that I'll be sneaky and I'll use the term bring about, because that kind of fudges the difference between causes and constraints very deliberately. But we do say things like, this morning GE reported that it will discontinue Model XYZ and so on. Well, what is the organization or managerial counterpart of an intention? How does an organization bring about changes deliberately? And we're all interested, I think, in what brings about what and how can we influence it if what's happening is something we don't want. And In particular, how do leaders bring about changes in their organizations? So a lot of times I'll use terms from biology, but just try to use that metaphorically and try to think in terms of organizations or cultures or practices, that sort of thing. So I think the traditional way of thinking of activity, of agency, is in terms of the grammatical distinction between active versus passive. Traditionally, since Aristotle, about as traditional as you can get, agency is the source, the origin of change. And we think in terms, tsunami destroyed a village, the sun made the plant grow, I flip the light switch, Jimmy threw the ball, that sort of thing. We tend to think of it in terms of the transmission of energy by an active agent to what is usually considered a passive matter. So the counterpart is the patient, that to which something is done, that suffers, that's on the receiving end of another's action. The ball was thrown by Jimmy, and so on. And this kind of was the framework that Newton ran with, and this is in a sense how most of us, when the word cause is used in philosophy, in science, that's the way it tends to be understood. So the problem with this way of understanding causes and effects is it does not explain how do cultures arise. And please think of the term culture very broadly. I'm thinking of it as, for example, a framework in which people are embedded or entrained and which conditions their behavior, their dispositions, their thoughts. How does that happen? How does this framework affect their behavior? How does it change their behavior to from what it would be? They weren't entrained in, embedded in this overall framework we can call a culture or an organization. I'm thinking, for example, of, we all know the video of the gorilla in the room. You know, obviously the reason why the observer does not see the gorilla in the video is because they have been primed, they have been cued, they are tuned to follow the bouncing ball. So obviously that somehow affects what they perceive. We know subconsciously they probably do see some bulk going across the screen, but they don't perceive it as a gorilla. How does that happen? And another example from Sartre is the example of a bus stop, which I really like. Here I have a bunch of people who don't know each other standing at a bus stop waiting for the bus. And the bus is late, the bus is late, the bus gets worse, later and later and later. All of a sudden, a culture, they coalesce into a group. And once that group coalesces, they will behave differently because they are embedded into that group. A stranger who wandered by would have no idea what's going on. They wouldn't react the same way as those who are now entrained into that group dynamic that will affect how they behave. So what I found was every time we're talking about a phenomenon like this, where a general context or framework influences the members, the components, the stages of this framework, whenever it doesn't fit the old classic cause and effect energetic model, people start using terms like conditions or factors. So then the question is, well, how do the individuals intertwine such that a culture, a system, a framework, as I just described, emerges? How do conditions do that? How do they make events intertwine and align, if you want to use that term, so that what systems dynamics people call a system emerges? In particular, I'm I will come back over and over again to the notion of a catalyst. How does a catalyst influence future events? One very important thing is catalysts do not themselves transfer energy. They facilitate the transfer of energy. Well, to me, that facilitation is causal, but nobody wants to use the word cause to refer to that process. How does feedback influence events? Same answer. The feedback itself isn't adding more energy, but somehow it is able to transform things. So then once that culture coalesces, how does it then loop back down and influence the members without which the culture wouldn't exist at all in the first place? I think sometimes we tend to then use the terms like, oh, this is a structural problem, this is a structural condition. I think that's what people are referring to when they use that kind of language. That is, how does the whole affect the component? And so what I want to do, to be even pickier about terminology here, is I want to make a distinction between what I call an environment versus a context. I don't know what terms to use. I'm just trying to make distinctions here. To me, I want to use the word environment as things in the environment that act on things out there, not connected, that act on a system as a classical cause. You know, the example that I gave, that tsunami destroying the village, that is a perfect example of something that can be beautifully explained as a classical cause. No question, no problem. You wouldn't use the word constraint. It is a cause. It destroyed the village. Or an invasive pest that destroys the ecosystem, not as an evolutionary replacement, but rather it just wipes it out, for example. Whereas I would like to use the word context to imply the framework, the group dynamic, the holism, the coherence that I was trying to describe with the Sartre example, or the being tuned into the instructions you were given to only pay attention to where the bouncing ball is. So I think what's important here is the term external applies to the environment, whereas wholes or these frameworks are made up of components that are embedded. I don't know how else to describe it. They're embedded. They're just not plunked into empty space and time. They are embedded into, and they are part of what produced that coherent dynamic. And in fact, they participate not only in generating the dynamic, but in preserving and maintaining that dynamic. So let's put it differently. Seems to me there's a big difference between clumps and coherent wholes. And by the way, thermodynamics and in a sense Newtonian mechanics really don't have much room for coherent wholes. They usually think in terms of aggregates or masses that do not have emergent properties, at least traditionally. Now with quantum mechanics, it's all changing now, but thinking of the classical way of looking at these. You know, if you break up a large slab of granite, you have smaller slabs of granite. You know, the properties of the clump as a whole is simply the sum of its components. The sum of the property of the sand dune is simply the outcome of the number of grains of sand there are. I would want to say that sand dunes are not wholes. Please don't bring up Perbach and all that. I understand that. I'm trying to sort of make a conceptual distinction here. Pick, you know, the mound of the city dump you've got behind you. That's not a whole. It has no emergent properties. Whereas what I would like to say, or what I used the term context before, these really are coherent entities that have somehow coalesced as a unit. And what I want to argue is that that's because the components are no longer external to each other, like a grain of sand is only related externally, it's next to the other one. But they have become somehow interdependent with each other. And this interdependence is also with the environment and the time frame in which it occurs. So that what happens is that this interdependence generates a coherence that has emergent properties that the components separately do not. And in contrast with a slab of granite, if you rip apart an organism, you do not end up with smaller organisms. That was Montaigne's famous phrase of "il faut tuer pour analyser," meaning you've got to kill the organism to analyze it. So analysis, which since Francis Bacon and Descartes and so on has gotten the best press ever, what I think we've forgotten is how there is a coherence that produces emergent properties that matter. And that is a term from the cosmologist George Ellis. It wouldn't matter, no pun intended, if the whole didn't have any interesting properties. But the whole ends up having very interesting properties. In the case of an organism is alive, right? The bone by itself won't be for long. So that's why I find this notion of how things cause what. So parts of a clump do not change their properties. They're just still there. They're related only externally and numerically, and so the clump gets bigger or smaller depending how many more particles there are. But in the case of a whole, the whole does acquire emergent properties in virtue of this interdependence among the parts, and the interdependence between the parts and the context the whole itself is embedded in. So what happens is we tend then to start using terms like components. We don't use the word component for this rock in the city dump down the road. That's just a particle that's part of the dump. Whereas once there is that interdependence, they become components which we understand intuitively to mean they're somehow related to the whole that they contribute to. And so they change their properties, especially their behavior, in virtue of being parts of a whole. And so, say, if the whole is a synchronous phenomenon, it's synchronized, then the individual components align with respect to each other in order to produce and maintain that synchronous relationship. And so the question then is, well, how does that happen? How does that coherent whole form? And that's why you hear me talking about constraint, because at least it gets me a term that's more or less used in science, that isn't sort of a weird Whiteheadian neologism like prehension, which I have no idea what that means. And a whole bunch of people have tried to use those terms, but the problem is you invent a neologism, nobody uses, so I don't know what else to use, and that's what I started using in dynamics in action, is the notion of constraint. So what I would like to say is that coherent whole, somehow these people standing at the bus stop, somehow the instructions to the person participated in that experiment with the gorilla, those instructions, those conditions act as constraints that produce an interdependence that creates a whole that's larger than the individual components. And I want to say that this happens not only at the human level, not only at the human organizational level, it happens at the physical level. Clocks sitting on a shelf will synchronize. Menstrual cycles, so biologically it happens. Menstrual cycles in dorms synchronize. Clearly hibernation is some kind of tuning in with day length, with light, the amount of light, We have not a clue how these 17-year cicadas that came out last summer, the summer before, happened. We have no idea how that happens. How does this overall coherent context come from? But we've known for centuries that soldiers marching in a particular cadence will synchronize, and the emergent property there obviously is they can collapse a bridge. What I don't want to do is to reify context or reify those holes. I don't want to say there's something other than. I don't want to make it a élan vital the way Bergson does, where he says, oh, well, that's kind of a spark from without that makes these things hang together and come together. No, I want to say that these coherent wholes are the interdependence constraints established among what used to be separate and independent parts, and they are now components. And I think there's a reality to that context. It's not just epistemology. I don't think it's just knowledge. And the example I would think might make some sense is CEOs might come and go, but oftentimes nothing changes in the process because the cultural context is such that it entrains even the CEO that comes in. I don't know enough about Disney and Iger and the guy that he just replaced, and so he came back again. But that would be, I think, an example. So I would want to use the word environment for what is going on in the rest of the world out there. And the environment influences individuals, not in terms of interdependence, but in a sense as forceful impacts. But there's something different going on in hibernation, in synchronized clocks, in emergent dynamics. So I put this together, and I'm terrible at doing these things. I have no idea how to do these things. But if you kind of summarize what I just said, is that the environment kind of acts as a forceful cause. It's an externally related to what it's pushing around. And so the properties of that environment are nothing more than the sum of the parts. Whereas in the case of a context, it acts as a constraint. Once that group coalesces at the bus stop, or once the person is tuned into or is entrained into the instructions that were given to him or her, then there is an overall dynamic that has emergent properties that would not occur otherwise. Things like cohesion, being alive, and so on. And I think the key is the idea of interdependence. And of course, then the question is, how does that interdependence come about? The interdependence shows some kind of an order. And those emergent properties are relational, novel properties that appear as a result of those interactions and relations. So rather than thinking of the same grains of sand as the basis for wholes, what we start realizing that that the properties that matter for these complex dynamical wholes are what's connected to what, how strongly are they connected, when are they connected. So these are relational properties. They are not particulate properties, if you will. So then what makes a coherence coalesce? I want to say it's constraints that turn these events conditional upon each other. So all of a sudden, the prior probability of something happened changes to a conditional probability. It's not just that, there's a likelihood that this is going to happen. No, what happens is, given that this other thing is going on in the environment, it all of a sudden changes the conditional probability of what's going to happen next. And so among these constraints, I think, very significantly are things like catalysts, the process of feedback. I would want to say probably constructive interference between waves. The tsunami is usually a whole bunch of smaller waves that the constructive interference makes it possess a different kind of sense of property. So then the first question is, what makes this wholeness coalesce and what generates it. But the other thing I think that's just as important is what makes the coherence persist despite changes to the components. See, in the case of a sand dune, of a clump or an aggregate, a really forceful energetic cause will simply destroy the clump, will destroy the mass. But what's interesting about these coherent dynamics is that they're able to persist despite changes in the individual components and the individual process that make them up. And so if we think as the organism, that we can't break up and still have smaller organisms, that we can't, the organism as this coherent whole, the cells come and go, and we know the cells come and go, but the organism as a whole continues to persist. In organizations, employees, members, leaders, bosses come and go, but oftentimes the organization persists. And so then the question is, why? And here's where my notion of enabling context-dependent constraint comes into the picture. I want to say that an enabling constraint are events, entities, processes that facilitate energy flow in certain directions at certain speeds and thereby intertwine initially separate and independent processes into, I don't know what else to call it, but an interdependent skein. But it's not just physical things like threads of a yarn, but rather dynamics can become intertwined into an interdependent and therefore more expanded, more expansive, more comprehensive dynamic that I'm going to say later on. That's where the emergence comes from. So, but what's very important is not just the term enabling, but the term context dependence. I want to say that enabling constraints embed events. Not only do they intertwine them into a whole that's greater than the individual strands were initially, but it also embeds them in a particular time and a space. So the future events become conditional about what's going on around them and what happened before. So place and moment become critical in what I'm calling context, whereas for Newton, the environment is this empty vessel container that is always there, that's empty, that's devoid, that is universal, that never changes. So what's important about context dependence is all of a sudden these phenomena are by no means one size fits all. They are the opposite of one size fits all almost. I think ecologists intuitively understand this. They understand that there's a critical window for intervention, and I would say probably an organizational leader is the same. They understand, look, it's got to be done, and it's got to be done now, and it's almost more important that it be done than what is going to be done. You miss the window, and the very same action 6 months from now won't work. A catalyst will not catalyze under different conditions at a different moment in time. So I want to say that enabling constraints generate interdependent wholes, and it's the interdependence that makes them coherent. They're not just massed and clumped together, they're interdependent, meaning they are mutually dependent. They're one thing becomes conditional on everything else, and everything else becomes conditional on that. I also want to say that they're context dependent, that they embed events in space and time, and that's why Prigogine used to say these processes are all historical. They're not just temporal, they're historical. So, causes transfer energy. Enabling constraints are what some people like to call factors or conditions that do not directly transfer energy, but to facilitate it so that a significant qualitative, by significant I mean they're qualitatively different, effect becomes generated. Again, I don't want to reify these things. These effects, these outcomes, these interdependent, intertwined schemes or expanded dynamics just simply represent a phase transition to a novel because interdependent, a novel because relational form of organization. And that's what the emergence of complexity, I think, represents. So much so that if you try to reduce these complex, interdependent, relational, not one size fit all, sui generis dynamics, you're going to lose the relational emergent properties that matter. That was again Montaigne's point about il faut tuer pour analyser. You're gonna kill it. You're not gonna see anything being alive. An example that this brings to mind is a long time ago in the 60s with the war on poverty. People in America under the Johnson administration thought if we throw enough money at the problem, that'll solve the problem of poverty. They were thinking in terms of causes and effects. What they forgot was all the enabling constraints that are also required to generate a real new phase transition to a non-impoverished world. So even though I certainly am not saying that money is not necessary, I'm not saying transfers of energy is not necessary to bring things about. What I'm trying to do is to focus on these other factors or conditions that are absolutely necessary as well to bring about a phase transition to a qualitatively novel dynamic. And so enabling constraints, I want to restrict the use only to when they're bottom-up and generative. They facilitate the formation of a coherent dynamic that is greater than the constituent parts that are constrained and intertwined. That coherent dynamic becomes, in a sense, the context in which the components are embedded. I'll give you an example. Organelles in a cell, the mitochondria, the nucleus, and so on, they act very differently inside a cell than they do in a petri dish. The cell provides a holistic context that has qualitatively different properties than the individual organelles, and it constrains the components and has those emergent properties. Crudely, people act very differently in the workplace than they do outside. We act differently around our parents than we do with our friends. People walking by the bus stop will act very differently than those who've been entrained into that group dynamic somehow. So the phase transition, I would want to say, has coalesced what I'm calling a constitutive constraint regime. In other words, the overarching I don't want to use the word holistic, it's so overused. The dynamic really then has suddenly become itself a constraint regime. So that group at the bus stop has become, there are no new people there. There's nothing, no physical difference in the folks at the bus stop. But what has changed is that all of a sudden there is a constraint regime that has coalesced as an overarching constraint regime that holds together those people into the interdependencies that have been formed. It gets real hard to just walk away from that bus stop and say, oh, well, I kind of got fed up, I'm leaving. It's a lot harder than it would have before that coherence has generated. So I want to say there's a constraint regime that is constitutive of that overall contextual dynamic. And then what I want to say, and this is where it gets tricky, is that that overall constraint regime acts in such a way that it acts as a governing second order constraint that top down keeps these people in that dynamic. It makes it a lot harder for them to walk away. The conditional probability of them walking away once they've been entrained into that dynamic is way lower than it would otherwise. And so when we talk about that, this is really a structural problem. I think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about some constitutive constraint regime that is somehow governing the behavior of the individual parts. So right off the bat, I think that what this gives me is the notion of the generation. I'm not going to say hierarchy, I'm going to say heterarchy, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But we're talking about relationships between parts and wholes. And the parts become intertwined because of enabling constraints, but that creates an overall constitutive constraint, then acting as a governing constraint limits or restricts the behavior of individuals to keep that coherence going. So, to repeat, constitutive constraints are a set of interdependencies the constraints of which serve as sort of a system-wide architecture or a network of constraints that preserves that mutual dependence that got generated. And so it's a constitutive constraint that can be described as in terms of emergent parameters. I think the term coherence is a shortcut for what might be called a parameter that tells you, look, this is how these things hang together to keep this whole going, so to speak. Governing constraints act top down on their components. And I think it's in terms of the constitutive governing constraints that organisms as a whole persist despite changes to the micro level. The organism's constitutive constraints as a whole acting as governing constraints, and you know what? We call that homeostasis. It's in terms of this top-down homeostatic control system that this organism as a whole persists despite the comings and goings of the various cells. They come and go, they die, they're born, but the system as a whole persists thanks to those constitutive constraints. So, bottom-up, context-dependent enabling constraints generate an overarching constraint regime. Call it homeostasis. With certain parameters, some are more cohesive than others, some are more coherent than others. Some dynamics are more equalizing than others. But all of them have a certain range of viability that holds them together. If they exceed that range of viability, the constitutive constraint falls apart. So, what is a constitutive constraint regime? I would want to say that it is the set of constraints that intertwine and constitute the metastability that an organism has that the individual cells or organs that make it up lack. So I think the way to think is in terms of once these new functions, once these qualitatively emergent properties arise, you have a level of metastability that supersedes the stability of the individual components that come and go. How does it keep it whole? I think it acts top-down as a second-order governing constraint by restricting the behavior of the components to within its range of viability. If that constitutive constraint, top-down, starts to decohere, then you have the possibility, for example, of cancer. What is a cancer? Cancer is a cell that has slipped the bounds of the metastable constitutive constraint regimes hold. And so by restricting the behavior, you stabilize the system and you don't let it decohere. So to me, a governing constraint and a top-down constraint is absolutely a critical factor. It is not a bad thing. We tend to think of it as a bad thing because we're thinking in terms of old-time hierarchy and hierarchical systems that control top-down through energetic commands. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about more like a virtual governor, the way homeostasis governs its component processes and dynamics. This, I think, is pretty repetitive, but except for the last two. I think the way governing constraints govern is that they internally change the values and the settings in terms of which the components operate. For example, by changing the time frames in which the components become activated or deactivated, the tolerance range that they can accept of perturbations from outside. It changes the margin of error within which the system will continue to operate. Some are more flexible than others. Their margin of error are broader and so are more flexible and resilient. Others are not. And so that's what second order governing constraints change top down. So how do you affect change? Well, if you're dealing with clumps and masses and aggregates, you just by forceful impact, you just get rid of it. You sweep the sand dune away. You bring a bulldozer and you sweep away that debris. But if what you want to do is to facilitate the emergence of a coherent dynamics, forceful impacts do not produce coherence. As a friend of mine, Bob Artigiani, who taught many years at the Naval Academy, always said, Newtonian forces move things, they don't change anything. Meaning, there's no qualitative novelty. And that's the whole basis for the idea of reductionism and so on, and I won't get into. So if you want to facilitate the emergence of a coherent dynamic, you're operating bottom up. So you've got to find or implement or introduce catalysts, set up more efficient feedback loops, and other channels of communication that will facilitate this intertwining novel dynamic. But if you want to preserve or stabilize what is already a coherent whole, then you do so not through enabling constraints. You do it by strengthening the constitutive constraints, by reinforcing the desirable internally generated fluctuations so that coherence holds. Or you provide cover for maybe a bit of a novel fluctuation so that the system can handle that novel fluctuation. Or by removing impedances to a new idea so that the system as a whole can continue to handle it and accomplish it. So, but then the most difficult one, and I don't even have this in the book, what happens if the regulatory system itself, the constraints of the overall system stop holding? The changes in the context have been so incredibly dramatic, say, that it doesn't matter how much flexibility you have, the way the settings are set right now, it just cannot handle these novelties. So what you have to do is you have to change the parametric settings, which is very different from strengthening the existing parameters, strengthening the existing constitutive constraints. You have to really reset the parameters. You have to change the set points. And that's what I think is most difficult. We're not sure we know how to do that. But what this gives me, I think, is a way of thinking in terms of structure, function, and regulation. Bottom up, you're enabling. And bottom up, through intertwining of structures, you can produce novel functions. Top down, those functions can regulate, how much slack you can give the structure, and it'll still continue to hold. And that's because an organism can remain coherent, for example, in multiple ways. You can remove the spleen. Homeostasis handles it. It handles it. You replace an aortic valve with a pig's aortic valve or with an artificial aortic valve, and still the parameters can function. They can be variously realized. But that multiple realizability is not infinite. It has its limits. So a well-operating, top-down, governing functional control only works within a viable range of conditions, under this range of conditions and this range of responses. Let me see. It's about 10 minutes till. I think I would like to stop here. I've got some other ideas about regulation. Well, let me do this one. If context changes so dramatically, then the constitutive constraints, the governing constraints, will be completely out of kilter with the current environment. And there are all sorts of really interesting theories coming out that maybe that's what something like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is about. It's that the settings, the set points of the system have gone out of kilter and they are no longer responding to the current environment. Remember, all of these things are context dependent. So if they quit being context dependent, all of a sudden they're, that trauma is on all the time, then the way to change that is you have to change the setting, which is very different. And so the role of a regulator in an organization would be to anticipate when that threshold of instability or decoherence is approaching, and either expand the range of conditions under which the existing system will work, or to expand the range of responses or capabilities of the system to be able to accommodate this wider, different range of conditions that's coming at you. So the role of the regulator is to monitor and adjust the system's possibility or adaptive space. I would say regulation goes with strategy. You don't mess with the strategy. The strategy is okay. It's just the implementation that's not working. That's what we were talking before. You strengthen the parameters so the parameters can continue to operate under these conditions. But when the system has become so out of kilter with the environment, then the strategy is not going to work. So I can give you examples from cardiovascular, but then I'll leave this for you as the questions and answers happen. I was going to spend a lot of time talking about inflammation and pain as two examples coming out of biology that I find fascinating because they make this distinction between structure, function, and regulation that I think apply to organizations, to human organizations, as well as they do to biology. So anyway, folks, that's it. That's all, folks. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, if I was ignoring your questions in the chat, I was, because I was paying attention to Alicia. So, that's the thing. I dropped a couple of links in the chat where you can find Alicia's book at MIT Press. Our goal is to make it the beach read of 2023, so please pre-order.
Thank you.
Okay, so I see that people have been a little active in the chat, so let's see who's got a question. And you can raise your hand, or you can put a Q in front of whatever you have to say in the chat, and I will read it for you. So any questions? Don't make me call on you.
Barbara, I cannot, I guess I should say end slideshow, and then maybe that way I can see you guys.
Yeah, they want you to unshare the screen so everybody can be seen. Okay. Don't forget, the video will be posted to our Complexity Lounge page Whenever Jocko decides to,
Got it. And I've got two sets of bibliographies there that will, I hope, help.
Okay, so we'll put a link to the Vimeo page in the chat as well.
Okay.
So, who's got questions? I know I do, but I'm going to defer to you guys.
Oops.
All right, so Gemma, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, okay, thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Alicia. Oh my gosh, it's so impactful. It's such a like holiday gift. I would just love to hear more about the inflammation example.
Oh my
because
goodness.
I find human is one of just the best examples of complexity.
All right, should I go with that? Okay, let's see. Let me go back and take a look at my notes. All right. It's fascinating to me. There was an article that I can also add to the bibliography that was a survey article on where our knowledge about inflammation is right now. And apparently inflammation has three very distinct dynamics. If you are injured, the cat scratched me, I am injured, and so that's going to make the function of the skin break down. So that's a bottom-up process. The structure has been damaged, and that, there's no intertwining and no constraints that are going to work if the structure itself on which those constraints are working are damaged. So what happens is that then the body will produce white blood cells and whatever the T cells, and that they will repair the damage to the injury. So in a sense, you fix the bottom up and the top, the function reestablishes automatically. That's kind of the notion of inflammation we've all understood. But the function has a range of background conditions, the constraints that evolution has selected for, and those kind of provide the existing settings. That's my terminology. The existing settings are set points. Now, what happens is that if those background conditions are not met, for example, folks, those of you in the UK who are freezing to death, the body will, in the absence of injury, you still don't have frostbite, but you're cold as hell. Your body will produce shivering. And so the shivering is in order to tweak the function so that it operates at a bit of under wider ranges of conditions. You normally wouldn't shiver under normal, the center of the range of viability. But when you're at the edges, the system can, in anticipation of injury, tinker with, readjust the condition so that it works, so that you still, you won't get frostbite because you're shivering, you're generating your own heat. Okay, fine. But there's a third level of dynamic that they're now thinking about, and that is, even in the absence of injury, even in the absence of those conditions, there is a sense in which the actual set points of the system, it's not that you're trying to get the switch to be, say, a dimmer switch that it can handle a wider range rather than just on and off, but this is the switch of the homeostatic system is set permanently on. And that's what may happen with post-traumatic stress disorder. And post-traumatic stress disorder produces inflammation because the body's trying to do something to handle this permanently on switch. It doesn't know what to do. And apparently, with respect to pain, it's the same thing. Usually, pain is a response to an actual injury to tissue. Fine. But there are anxiety, might be the anticipation of injury when the injury has not happened yet. That's more like when you're so cold you start shivering, and so you're anxious ahead of time. But it may be that things like chronic fatigue syndrome or chronic pain might be some kind of a similar phenomenon where the switch is just permanently set on. So you have to reset that switch. And that's what I think in a lot of cases, we never think about it that way. That's why nobody had ever thought of inflammation in those terms. It was always bottom up because we're always thinking in terms of energetic causes rather than top down, the constitutive constraints themselves going awry. And that's why I find that structure, function, and regulation distinction with respect to constraints very interesting.
Okay. All right. So any hands up? No? Okay, I'm gonna go to the questions in the chat. So Chris Butler had to leave, but he said, as a sort of comment question, I've been thinking about strategy as a governing constraint and regular retrospectives as enabling constraints. I wonder if there is anything about how the theory on governing constraints would indicate a good way to write strategy and communicate it.
Well, when you're writing strategy, I think you're writing the whole regulation. And so what you have to do is to, I think, begin to probe what's going on at the local level and see how much you can change or how. I think that's the most difficult part of all. I think understanding how you can tweak function to get it to broaden its applicability is easy. Changing strategy is almost like an all or nothing thing. It gets very difficult to do piecemeal. I do not know. I do not know how you would, and you can rewrite the whole organizational strategic book. I don't know. I think that's what perhaps people were getting folks to try to focus on when they were talking about vision and mission. At least if you start looking at what the vision and the mission is, you kind of gives you some senses if your strategy's in the right location or not. Move this over here. Try to get out of the sun here. It's only 6 weeks in the whole year that the sun's here.
Okay. All right. Well, Dave has his hand up. So we're going to move to that so I don't have to read another question for a while. So Dave, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I've done that. Two questions really. One, your last email puzzled me because you said, why didn't I challenge you on analog nature of top-down constraint? And I was thinking about that and thinking, well, it's obvious the analog is not digital, but sometimes it goes through phase shifts. So that was question number one, right? Because I'm not sure I understand why I should have challenged you on it, so I'm trying to find out. The second one, and I think I've asked you this before, is how does this relate to Deleuzian assemblage theory? Because we've always used assemblage theory in context of enabling constraints, and you never do, and I'm a bit puzzled about that one.
And I think I'm going to defer that question because I don't understand Deleuze half of the time. I don't understand his language.
Okay.
So, but what I think happens is individual cells, through constraints, intertwine to create an entity. I'm going to be vague. An entity that is multiply realizable. That tissue or that organ, you can cut out half of the liver and the liver will still continue functioning. I mean, it's got graceful, it degenerates gracefully. Why? Because it's multiply realizable. So I think one of the things that what enabling constraints do is they create a whole that is multiply realizable. I think what that means is that when then the whole constrains its component parts, it can do so as an analog control mechanism, as a dimmer switch rather than a toggle switch, and thereby be a lot more sensitive to context and task appropriate than you would if you simply had an on-off switch, the way you often think about energetic.
So I get that. All right, then let's take two examples. So if you look at large corporate change, and I've had to live through that, yeah, what happens is most of the time it's an analog-based control, and it's dealing with a series of emergent properties or attractor mechanisms, which are really difficult to disrupt. I mean,
that's their
found
point.
that in IBM. Within 6 months of people joining IBM, they've changed their personal stories to match the dominant stories of the culture. And that's one of the ways it survives, all right?
That's what constitutive constraints do. They stabilize a system, right?
You've got that. But then what happens is the company almost goes background. Lou Gerstner comes in. Everything gets radically disrupted. You get a phase shift for a period, but then interestingly, 10 years later, the whole original reestablishes itself. Now, that's interesting. But the second one is what's happening to Musk and Twitter at the moment. Because he's trying a forceful disruption of the system to actually break a culture. That's what I was saying. Is there a phase shift or a force element in these?
Oh, it's definitely a phase shift. The question is, some coherent dynamics might have tapped into such an incredibly resilient set of dynamics that it seems to go on and survive even though the context changes pretty dramatically. And so the question is, how do you change it otherwise? And that used to be the old Marxist argument about you really had to disrupt the family structure, you had to disrupt everything to make the thing not work. But then it has to work in a context. So I had a paper that I wrote ages ago about, it's very interesting that all utopian literature in the West, there is no utopian literature in the Far East, because I think the Far East is very interested in process and whereas the West thinks in terms of ideals, and these ideals are going to be universal dynamics, and that they're going to
It's all post-Enlightenment as well, Alicia. All utopians are post-Enlightenment literature. They're not pre-Enlightenment literature. And that's really...
oh, no, Plato too. Plato's Republic, same problem.
No, that's not a utopia.
Oh, well, he thought it was. Anyway, what's interesting about those is they're all isolated from the environment. So the problem is, once they're set up, they have no place to go but downhill, because they have no place to evolve to becoming better, because they have no context dependence. But it's a tricky wicket to keep a system going while you are allowing it enough flexibility to evolve. That's why in the book, I didn't mention it here, but in the book I talk a lot about William Wimsatt's, I don't even have it in the bibliography. William Wimsatt talks about generative entrenchment. I call them generative constraints. For example, the constraints in pregnancy, in ontogenesis, in a development of an embryo, are incredibly rigid early on. If there's anything that goes off on those early constraints, the whole thing falls apart, and you usually get a miscarriage, because those are the basic constraints that establish the fundamental bow plan, the general basic plan of the organism. Once those are set, once those are working, then it's interesting that subsequent constraints are an awful lot more flexible. They allow variability in the development in the last, say, 2-3 months of the organism. Usually you're not going to get a miscarriage in the last couple of months, even though there's incredible range of variability because the constraints are very flexible. So I think we should think in terms of differential constraints, differentially timed constraints, or constraints that are differentially implemented depending on the actual conditions that are existing at the moment. That's even harder to think about, because then you've got to sort of stop one and start another one going while the other one continues in effect. So one has to be rigid enough to stabilize it, but flexible enough to allow these other constraints in situ, ongoing, to implement context, task dependence, and so on.
I could carry on, but other people, so Juno's there. So.
Sue, you're on mute. Sue, you're on mute. I mean, Barbara, you're on mute. Sorry.
All right, well, this is why I'm running this thing, right? Because I don't know. Okay, Juno, your hand is up, so why don't you go next?
Hi, yes. Thank you so much for the presentation. So interesting to hear Dave mention the example from IBM and then Twitter. I'm a systems practitioner and software engineer who until last month or thereabouts was at Twitter. So I got to witness the whole interesting situation firsthand. I was very interested in this presentation because of the title and the focus on constraints. And as I was listening to everything, I was putting this in conversation in my head with the work of Lauren Ross, a professor in the philosophy of science at UC Irvine, with a background in neuroscience. So as you mentioned, from the biology domain. And she also focuses a lot on constraints in causation in maybe a little bit more rigorous way than we're used to in as systems practitioners. I was really interesting to hear the emphasis on time, and as you were just bringing up again with differentially timed constraints, because it occurred to me hearing your example of the persistence of an organism, that there's a certain capacity for the organism to absorb change. And if it happens all at once, it might kill the organism. If it happens more gradually, the organism might adapt to that change. I was curious if you could elaborate on
Absolutely,
the timing
and
aspects.
I don't think we understand how that happens, but the whole notion of habituation and so on, absolutely, that there is probably a process where Tim Allen and Starr in their book on evolution talk about how there is no such thing as a regular disruption. As soon as it's regular, somehow the biological system figures out a way to either co-opt that perturbation and thereby incorporate it into its own dynamic or expand its dynamic to incorporate it. So I think in the neurological structure, that's exactly what happens. Infants are born with an awful lot more neurons than they will end up with as adults. They are, apparently from what I understand, is disorganized, they are jumbled. What happens with the feedback from the environment and behavior and the weight of the body and so on, and all these changes happening in a progressive, also time constrained way, what happens is that the initial set of neurons in the brain, as my understanding is, they get pruned, and it's almost as if the brain is laying down the interstate highway system in virtue of those context dependent constraints, and it's that organization that probably subtends mental events and emotion, all that stuff. I absolutely agree with that.
Okay. Juno, is that an answer to your question?
It was in a sense. I guess maybe to elaborate on the organizational side, is there? I guess what does that suggest in terms of interventions or how to think about bringing about intentional beneficial change around how to incorporate timing or how to assess the timing of interventions?
And I'm not a practitioner. From a theoretical point of view, the sort of intervention you would introduce when the process is becoming is beginning to coalesce, correct? I would think would be sort of the standard educational practices and advice that people have. You provide the child with a safe environment, with a stable environment. You read to the child, and nutrition, and so that hopefully those are the enabling constraints, physiologically, physically, nutritionally, intellectually, emotionally, that will enable the right connections to produce the right dynamics. Now, once you've got a fairly set constitutive regime, I'm assuming adulthood of some sort, whatever way you want to define that, and there is a problem, then that gets a lot more difficult to reprogram, if you will, a lot more difficult. And I suppose that's what cognitive behaviorism, behavioral practice of psychotherapy, things like habituation training, where if you're, apparently it's been very successful with obsessive compulsive disorder, you habituate the person slowly to, if I am acrophobic, I'm afraid of heights, so you get me to stand on a tiny little, ledge, and then go to high. And so that slowly, supposedly, you're sort of configuring, because what you end up with is a configuration that has emergent properties. And so one thing is to how you want to get the configuration that is desirable. And now you've got a configuration, and either the context has changed enough, so you need that configuration, which might have been desirable before, but you need it to be able to be adaptive in this new configuration. How do you get it to adapt, right? Or if it's really pathological, how do you get it to really evolve into a new dynamic, a new configuration? That's so all I was trying to present was different constraints would be required depending on a different conditions, different stages, different phenomena, and what you want to accomplish. And those interventions that might work at one stage will not work in another stage, even though it's the same person, or under other conditions.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So first of all, Alicia, let me just say that it made me feel really good that you don't always understand Deleuze's language either. Like that. Okay, I think
there's a bit of an emperor's new clothes there business. I don't know.
I feel so seen. I was like, oh, that's great.
Oh yeah, okay, but why couldn't he have said this differently?
Okay, so
I have the same problem with Whitehead. Whitehead is impossible. And I like what he says, but there's no way.
I just want to remind the group that we still have available to us 45 minutes or longer, so feel free to jump in with any questions for Alicia. We got her for quite a while longer, so
okay. I do have
encouraging you to jump in.
I want to have one question in the chat from Alexander. Alexander, if you'd like to unmute yourself, I'm all for it, but I will read this.
Yeah, I'm fine. I can also just
okay, go say words. Okay.
Wonderful. Yeah, so I'm just going to read this because I worded it out there basically, but it's about the distinction between clumps and coherent wholes that you made, and this is something I've also thought about a lot myself, and I thought always this kind of distinction that you make and that is also made in other literatures, right, is kind of a bit too simplistic maybe, because it doesn't take into account things that are somewhere in between. So you have the slabs of marble, for example, right, that you break up, you have more marble slabs or something like that. This works perfectly with stones and things like that. But it also seems to be that there are something like systems that are simple mechanical systems, something like guns are a good example, where you have the function of the entire system is the functioning of the entire system is dependent on the interdependence of its parts. So the hammer needs to be connected correctly to the trigger and things like that. But there doesn't seem to be any explanatory benefit to talking about the gun as a coherent whole. So if I want to explain why the gun as a whole is able to shoot bullets, all I have to do is say, these are the internal parts, they're hooked up this and this way. It's a very linear description, right? And ideally, when we defer explanations to a coherent whole, we want to have something more than just a linear description. Do you have anything additional that you think is necessary?
That's my thought about catalysts and feedbacks, and especially autocatalytic dynamics. I think these loops are pretty critical. It is difficult to exactly account for why, but I think that what happens, for example, with recursion and with iteration is when the last step of a process gets fed back into the first step. That's the difference, I think, between machine learning, right, and old-fashioned programming, correct? And old-fashioned programming is more like the gun. Programming, I put it together and then it gives me the output. But when you have this looping phenomenon, then the loop becomes the overall constitutive constraint that affects the component parts. And I think that's certainly true for autocatalytic structures, that if you don't have that nonlinearity, you don't get the emergent properties. My problem is that I tend to think of nonlinearities almost literally as a literal loop and a literal circle, but obviously you want dynamics that feed back into themselves in some way. It's Hofstadter's Old Strange Loops. You know, that Gödel, Escher, and Bach book was so beautiful so many years ago, and it's that strange loop of the relation between parts and wholes and parts that gives the whole a graceful degradation that the gun doesn't have. That if one little gear comes out, the gun won't fire anymore, by and large, which you don't have in these complex interdependent dynamics.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's worthwhile really putting that also in the definition of like, okay, this is really what we mean when we talk about coherent wholes, because just saying that, oh, you can't break them down into parts that are similar to the big part is not sufficient.
That's
but
a
yeah,
good point. That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, I should.
Okay. Okay, I have a couple follow-ups, and then we're just going to throw it open, and everybody can start talking. So, Gemma, you have a follow-up first, and then Juno.
Yeah. Hey, Alicia. Okay, here you are. Trying to find you. Yeah, actually, my question is a totally new question. So I'll just say the organization, the context I work in is in what we call team science. So basically, the idea is you pull scientists from very different disciplines together to tackle a big societal challenge that usually, in my case, usually funded by the National Science Foundation. So the organizational, I see the organizational shift is really really different, because most academic scientists that I work with, they're embedded in a very much hierarchical higher education organization. And then when they come to these big teams made of somewhere between 10 to 50 scientists, and then it becomes a very much horizontal network-based. You do have like a principal investigator that is the leader, that is mostly responsible to the founder, but really the way the organization works is very horizontal. So there's this big cultural shift from, hierarchical top-down to this horizontal. And so the shift is so big that I often say there's so many challenges associated with this shift, but your talk really helped me to understand this enabling constraint, especially this constitutive constraint, because I guess what I have observed is it's just really hard to form that constitutive constraint. Constitutive constraint. It just feels so overly distributed. There's not a center there, right? And then behavior-wise, you would observe, I would say there's a lot of teenage behaviors, right? These scientists, individuals, they all say, oh, I want to have a say on the decisions. And then when it's time to take action, nobody wants to take action. Or when before decisions made, there is input invited, nobody says anything. And then when it's decided that we go certain direction, and everybody comes out and say, oh, why did we go that? You never asked me. So I guess my question is, first is, how would you explain this cultural shift in terms of the constraints? And the second, what would your advice on how to help facilitate this shift?
I'm always amazed when anybody asks me for my advice about anything. I mean, philosophers just think about these things, and the practicalities kind of, oh, really? It's a lot more difficult for me. I think of constitutive constraints as distributed constraints, as what scientists call virtual governors. You know, you put several clocks on a shelf, or you put several metronomes on a shelf, and even though they start swinging separately as individuals, pretty soon they begin to oscillate in synchrony. And that is because the shelf serves as an enabling constraint that facilitates the transmission of energy. So you need the enabling constraint that facilitates the emergent interdependence between them. It won't happen without that enabling constraint. But nonetheless, it is not hierarchical in the sense that we're used to thinking of hierarchy as absolute top-down control. That's why in one of my slides I had it as nested heterarchy, because the idea that was, is that Simon? I have it in the book and I even forgot who. I think it's Herbert Simon who used that term. And it was a set of nested relationships that nonetheless can have, that can influence each other at the same hierarchical level, as well as bottom up and top down. Whereas our notion, our understanding of hierarchy is always this top down dictatorial edict from a ruler on down. And I prefer to think of biology as the metaphor that we can follow along those lines, that an ecosystem, the constitutive constraint regime, is a series of dynamical interdependencies between all the various species and individual organisms and different kingdoms, plants as well as animals and so on. So you have all these various constraint regimes that are intertwining into a distributed dynamic. And it's a nice example because we did not understand, for example, the role of the tiny little plankton in sustaining the overarching interdependence. And so people were very upset that ecologists were advocating for the preservation of the plankton, of the tiny organisms. Well, who cares about the plankton? Well, because we didn't understand these enabling constraints that enable the overarching system. So my only advice would be think biology, you know, emphasize that that's not the way a healthy ecosystem works. The constraints are distributed and the implementation is distributed.
Alicia, before we move on to the next question, Chris Matz would like to comment on this question. Chris? Chris?
Hi there. Hi,
Chris.
Gemma. So what you may find, there's a few people on this call who work in a very similar environment. It's not identical, but it's very similar when you're working with software teams. And that behavior of people behaving like teenagers is often because they're taking from the group, but they don't feel their identity within the group. And so one of the things that we do within software is we try and limit the size of teams between 7 plus or minus 2 people. If your teams are too big, basically people kind of like come as kind of parasites into the team and want things from the group, but they don't feel a sense of ownership and identity. I'm sorry I had to use the word identity there, Alicia, and I'll hopefully get away with it. But they have to, one of the constraints that you want to create with your teams is that the individuals in the group feel a sense of identity within the team. If your teams are too big, what you'll find is that they'll split or they won't have that sense of identity. But there's quite a few coaches I know on the call who are probably much better qualified to talk about this. But I think Hickman is a good reference. I think Mark Bogow could tell you more about that.
I like your comment about identity, because one thing about coherent dynamics in complex systems is that the components do not fuse into a undifferentiated block.
Mm-hmm.
If you do that, you've lost the complexity. You've turned it into a block, a piece of stone. Whereas the interesting articulation between parts and wholes is that the parts maintain a lot of their characteristics, but yet certain aspects of them do align, mostly their behavior, with respect to the whole in which they are entrained. But they don't have to lose their identity as, this plankton or that coral to function as, in fact, if that happens, the ecosystem as a whole usually breaks down. So it's an interesting dynamic there between the identity of the parts and the emergent processes of the whole. Yeah. Mark says it's Hackman, not Hickman.
See, told you Mark would know.
Mark knows everything. After Alicia, Dave, and the rest, Mark knows everything. Okay. Peter, you've had your hand up for quite some time.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Alicia, for half of your talk. The rest, I sort of was occupied thinking about the bus stop metaphor.
Sartre would be delighted.
And there's I got two questions that arise from thinking about that. So, does context always happen within an environment? Sort of when, and the other question is what happens to the constraint regime when sort of the bus finally shows up? Does that become the next constraint regime, and is that sort of related to Dave's Duchess curves and apex predator theory that sort of balance the whole system around it, sort of?
Very interesting. See, the bus stop, it's almost a very local system that got organized for a particular purpose, and once that purpose has been accomplished, usually you might find that system sort of, it becomes what is called a facultative system rather than an obligate or facultative. I never know which is which. It disintegrates. But for example, Allen and Starr use an example that I really love, and that is prairie grasses in the American Midwest, very large expanses of prairie grasses, get competition from either flowers that could take over and overwhelm the grasses, or forbs, animals like horses that will come in and eat the grasses. Apparently, from the point of view of the grasses, competition with the horses is a lot easier to handle than competition from the flowers. Apparently the flowers would really wipe out the grasses a lot better. So what seems to happen in the prairies is that the grasses put out these meristems, these little shoots at the end of the roots and the stems that invite the horses to come graze. And so in a sense they co-opt what was previously a predator, a competitor, and thereby enlarge the ecosystem. So now the predator becomes another component of what is a much more expansive and comprehensive constitutive regime. Now, would that happen in the bus stop? Would that happen so that these folks, if it happens 2 or 3 days in a row, maybe what will happen is they will go to the city and decide there's got to be a change in the bus schedules or an addition of purchasing of new buses. So if it's a regular problem, according to Allen and Starr, you get this kind of co-opting in nature. If it's not strong enough that it'll wipe it out to begin with, if it's just a regular, normal perturbation from the outside, it tends to Shanghai the perturbation and integrated into a wider dynamic, which I think is fascinating because in a sense, that's the way prokaryotes became eukaryotes. There probably was a mitochondria, a standalone mitochondrion that ended up getting engulfed by the single-celled organism, and all of a sudden you've got a multicellular organism with a nucleus inside and an energy-producing component to boot. I don't know if that answers your question. These are tough questions.
Yeah, well, Peter, you good with that for now?
Yeah, I'm good for now. Thank you.
Okay, good.
He's very nice.
I've been looking at the chat, and I think that in the future we're going to have Dave and Alicia back together to have a throwdown on continental and analytic philosophy in the realm of complexity.
I'll throw in the towel to Dave. I'm an American. I'm over here.
I think we can just have the two of you slug it out. I think that would be an awesome recording. Bernard, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question to Alicia about the difference between governing and enabling constraints, but if that's okay, I would like to build it on an example which contributes, I believe, to answering Juno's question about how you can influence bottom-up, emerging behaviors in culture, and the theory or the mechanism I'd like to describe is one which is connected to how conformity pressure happens in societies, organizations, and so on. And one way of looking at it is that when you look at pragmatic interdependence, so people depend on each other if they want to achieve their goals. And of course, that doesn't happen all the time. But especially in organizations, if I want to, fulfill my target, maybe even make a career, I depend with my claims on the acceptance of these claims by other people.
Yeah, nice.
By doing so just in order to achieve my goal, I tend to play to the acceptance criteria that I assume are already there. And as a consequence, I contribute to the persistence of these criteria. And as such, we have basically we contribute to the formation of a tractor base, and whatever is strong already has the best chances of becoming stronger and going on. And that explains partly why culture is often so slow in adapting in comparison to other things that an organization may change. Now, when you look at that, then you find several aspects that you can influence. For example, it means people want something. People have an intent. You can say, okay, what are the goals of people? What do we give them as tasks, as targets, and what do we not? How do they depend on each other and on each other's acceptance in order to fulfill their tasks? These dependencies can be influenced on the formal side of an organization, and of course they can be less influenced on the informal part. But still, by how you create, for example, monofunctional teams or cross-functional teams, you can change these criteria. How you influence criteria of promotion, for example, you can change these elements of this mechanism, and by that you can at least influence it. Now, as a question to you, Alicia, I'm wondering this mechanism that I just described. How do you sort that into your governing versus enabling constraints, especially this element of top-down, bottom-up? And maybe because I came into this conversation looking for something that I didn't find, or maybe I missed it, I don't know. To me, the question of governing versus enabling, I like to connect that also to the variety in a system, or to, enabling constraints increasing the number of options in a system, whereas governing constraints have the tendency to diminish. Now, the mechanism I just described has a tendency to diminish, to reduce the number of options. At the same time, it happens bottom up. So I don't know whether I'm making a confusion now of your criteria of these two categories of top-down governing versus bottom-up emerging, enabling constraints.
I don't know how much we can keep them completely apart, but I think, as I was hearing you speak, there was one word I did not use, and that is resonance. And I think that what enabling constraints do is they generate resonance, or they, perhaps in your terminology, find points where that other person would resonate with what you're trying to get them to do. But once you have resonance, a resonance is a form of coordination, correct? I think it resonates, it's an enlarged coordination. When you have that, you have generated a larger structure than the original.
Yeah, I think your word resonance would connect to my word conformity.
Yeah, well, exactly. So it's a form of conformity. In human beings, we use the word conformity, and in dynamics, we use maybe the word resonance. Again, I borrow from Alan and Starr because Alan and Starr have these wonderful examples. He says the thing about layers of heterarchies is that they may act in terms of energetic causes at an intra-level space, but inter-levels they act in terms of constraints. And here's the example he gives, which I love, and every academic will understand that. Suppose you've got a bunch of faculty members that are arguing. They're arguing about all sorts of things, and maybe they will resort to fisticuffs. That would be an energetic transfer, but usually not. But usually, doesn't matter how strong the argument is, they all go back to their offices and nothing happens unless one of them is the department chair. Or one of them is the dean. Correct? At that point, you have what? A hierarchical level of top-down possibility of constraint, but how does that dean control the faculty member? By changing the timing of the tenure process. I'm going to make it shorter. Oh boy, you might have a harder time getting tenure. I'm going to give you an additional year, makes it maybe longer. Bottom up, how can the bottom influence the top? If you're one of those faculty members and you happen to be a Nobel Prize winner or have a $5 million grant from the National Science Foundation of the European Union, you can always threaten that dean from taking your grants to a different institution. That immediately equalizes the asymmetry that would often that define different layers of organization. But again, none of this is energetic transfer. It is all a matter of you're changing the possibility landscape if you're the dean of the individual member, or you're changing the possibility landscape if you're the Nobel Prize winner of the dean, who now all of a sudden is going to lose that reputation and fame and so on, having that person in their department. So it's that. So the resonance has to be in place for the parts and the wholes to function in a healthy way. And then the parts will be happy to conform to the whole, because the whole, in a sense, reflects the interdependence among the parts, and so on. There's a resonance. But
in my wording, it would be it enforces or it changes the power to enforce acceptance criteria to the claims of others.
I don't want to.
So if I have a ground to take away, my acceptance criteria can become stronger.
I don't want to use the word power and enforce, because it could be almost more a matter of reputation. You're taking away the reputation, and that's as bad for the dean as otherwise. And so that's a constraint. That is because you've all of a sudden changed the possibility landscape, right? You've changed either the ruggedness of the attractors within the possibility landscape, or you've changed the actual boundaries of the landscape. And now, if I don't have this Nobel Prize winner in my faculty, now my options have gotten a lot smaller with the vice president. Correct?
Absolutely.
So that's why I steer away from energetic causality and so on. Not to say that doesn't apply. It does apply, but I want to pay attention to, I want to emphasize these other kinds of influences that simply change conditional probabilities of what is likely, what is not, what is possible, what is not, what is connected to what, how strongly is it connected to what, how much can it go off on its own or not, and continue to be part of the system. All of that. That's what I'm looking for. Nice, very nice comments. Thank you.
Okay. I would mention to all of you that there's some very interesting things in the chat, some good links. Mark dropped a link to Hackman's book in there, so that's a good look. It's good to take a look at that. Okay, Chris Matt has his hand up. I think this is the last question we're going to take, but we'll see what he has to say.
Hi, Alicia. Absolutely love the presentation. I love the way you kind of brought that all together, because one of the things that I think that presentation gave more than I've heard before is when you talk about the bus stop, my immediate thought was to go to Carl Weick, where he talks about spontaneous creation of organizations, but they're very temporary. Whereas what you're talking about is the spontaneous creation of an organization, and then those constraints stabilize it and give it, a longer life.
Correct.
And as I was thinking, whenever you mentioned bus stops, it made me wonder if there's anyone in London, you can confirm this. There's this really, so the thing about bus stops is they tend to be just, depending on where you go in Britain, if you go to an English town, which is predominantly English or Welsh or Scottish, people will queue for the bus. If you go to a bus stop in London, because London is a mixture of weird and non-weird individuals, it's basically an embodiment of the strategy of conflict, where everyone's basically positioning themselves to guarantee that they get the best seat and get a double seat. But the one anomaly is the enabling constraint that forms at Waterloo, or used to, pre-COVID, form at Waterloo Station, where because the same people are getting off the same train at the same time, this is the one I've mentioned before, it forms these amazing queues that can go for 200-300 meters, and people just naturally do it, even if they don't know that that's what meant to do, because, it's the most efficient way of doing a fair bus queue, and it prevents conflict, and people going to work in the morning don't want conflict in their they just want to get to work as serene as they can. So it'll be interesting to see if it still exists, because we don't have the same constraint mechanism. People aren't going to work every day. They're not getting on the train at the same time. They're not getting off at the same time and standing next to the same people roughly in the queue together. So you don't want to fight with someone that... So, I'm wondering if those long queues form in Waterloo Station. But what I love is how it's the closing of the second order constraint create the longevity. And the Carl Weick definition of an organization that's forms spontaneity, that's the first part, but it's the creating the life that you brought to life in that presentation. So thank you. I'm not really asking a question, which is a bit naughty, but...
And also, it's sort of the same problem with the iterated prisoner's dilemma compared to the one-off prisoner dilemma. The behavior is completely different in the one-off prisoner dilemma than it is in the iterated. When it happens over and over again, the constraint regime changes completely, and people will behave differently. Correct. That's why these loops and this iteration, I think, is extremely important. Something I didn't mention in this presentation, but that sort of forms the heart of the first part of the book, is philosophers and philosophers of science and scientists have been wary about circular causality forever. They don't like the idea of circular causality. That's why we've been so wedded to the idea of linear relationships. But as soon as you've got this circular causality, all hell breaks loose, it seems. You get emergent properties that are different from what they would have been otherwise. So it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very good point. Yeah, thank you.
You good, Chris?
And thank you. Great presentation. Back to you, Babs.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Well, I think that's all we have time for. I mean, we could go on all day, but I don't really think Alicia wants to.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a lot of fun. It forced me to put everything together into 20 slides. So thank you very much. It's very useful for me.
This was awesome. We really want to thank you for sharing your time and your work with us, and you're always welcome at the lounge. Maybe you'll come back for after the book comes out for part 2.
I will.
Okay, and then you and Dave.
Full of sand.
Right, and then you and Dave can have, a throwdown about philosophy. But I do want to encourage all of you again to pre-order the book so that we make it the 2023 beach read of the year. So yeah, Alicia, thank you so much. And Jocko and I would like to say thanks to all of you that have attended.
Thank you all for taking the time to participate in the question.
This wraps up our second year as a virtual meetup, and for the first timers, welcome, and we hope you come back. And for those of you that are regulars, we really appreciate and are very grateful to you for taking this ride with us. I mean, as you watch Jocko and I try to figure out how to do this. We're planning to have more wonderful guests in 2023, starting with Barry O'Reilly of Black Tulip Technology in January, so watch for that announcement. We can't wait to see all of you then, and whatever you celebrate at this time of year, have a blast. So thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Thank you all. Thank you very, very much.